We'd like to thank our sponsors, the Hydration Foundation, a nonprofit organization focused on better hydration for people, plants, animals, and soil. As the leading authority on hydration, the Hydration Foundation is dedicated to solving our health on this planet through creating better systems and conversations when it comes to water and how it moves through our bodies, irrigation, and food systems. You can learn more about the Hydration Foundation by navigating to www.hydrationfoundation.org. You can donate to Hydration Foundation's program to restore soil through water. With $33, we can rehydrate and decontaminate 1 acre of farmland with a better way for irrigation. Hi, my name is Yasmin Tarehi, and this is Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. Today's episode is about the end of life and how to prepare for death gracefully with BJ Miller, a hospice and palliative medicine physician and educator. He currently sees patients and families through Mettle Health, a company he co-founded with the aim to provide personalized, holistic consultations for any patient or caregiver who needs help navigating some of the emotional and practical issues that come with serious illness and disability. BJ's given hundreds of talks. His 2015 TED Talk, Not Whether But How, was viewed over 11 million times. He's been on Oprah Winfrey, PBS, the New York Times, and his book, A Beginner's Guide to the End, was co-authored with Shoshana Berger and published in 2019. I recently read it, and it's an incredible book with so much wisdom and information about the end of life. So thank you so much, BJ, for joining the show.
Thank you, Yasmin. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So, BJ, I'm so excited to talk to you because I think this topic and this subject is something that so much of our, at least Western culture, is not really paying attention to. And I think it's, very few people really talk about the end of life and death. It's something that we kind of hide today in culture. So I know that you've dedicated your life to this work. So since you've been a palliative and hospice physician, what does it mean in your terms and in your perspective to die well?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a great phrase. I mean, dying well can mean two different things, right? Like sort of doing a good job of it, essentially, like the tasks involved, etc. But the bigger way that at least I mean it is, that when we die, we can be well, we can be whole. Uh, in other words, it sort of pushes back on, as you're saying, but the sort of Western model of death is sort of, is the climax of illness or trauma or something going wrong, and by definition, in that lens, by definition, when you're dying, you are unwell. You are in it. But that construct doesn't really work very well and doesn't account for the totality that is dying. And because dying is a natural event and inevitability and nothing of a failing, it's just us doing our thing as natural beings. It is very possible to be well, to be whole as you head off the planet. And that's how I mean it. And on that note, so one is just doing what we just started to do is, kind of framing this for yourself. Death is a universal experience, and that every living creature does it, has always done it, probably always will do it. So getting that, just that alone helps me and many others just get in the ballpark here. So that's a great place to start. Is if you can find a way to rope death into your view of life, into your view of reality, well, then you're not going to be at odds with your nature, and you're not going to be at odds with your reality, and you're not going to be at odds with the fact that you die. You may not like it. You may not want to do it. You can kick and scream, whatever you want to do. It's filled with all sorts of emotion and sorrow. But sorrow isn't the enemy. I mean, all emotions are welcome. So, one is to start by framing the subject in a way that you can feel that death is approachable and part of your life, not this thing that robs you of life. That's key. And whatever words work for you, whatever framing works for you, find some way to do that. And then once you're in there, well, then that automatically takes care of some of the shame or the sense of failure. And if you follow the arc of the English language and the constructs we use around here, especially in the medical world, we say, people succumb to death. They lost their battle,
Mm,
implying again that death is optional. And if you do it, well, you've failed at something. Something went wrong. You went wrong. And again, if you buy into that, well, then you're going to have to hate yourself on top of having to die. So let me stop there as a mouthful. But I mean, that's a way in. There's a lot more to say. But am I making some sense? Does that register with
yeah.
you, Yasmin?
Yeah, absolutely, BJ. I mean, I think, the words die well, and I didn't even notice it, that the words that we're using when it comes to death, dying well, what you're essentially saying is it's a part of life, and living well is dying well. Like, it's just a natural process. And it is interesting because I think I'm also, trained maybe culturally to think of death as something negative, right? Like, so it's like we've, come to the end of our life, and we can no longer continue. Because I think also maybe part of culture, it feels like it's so linear, and there's a kind of assembly line feature to life. And so, I guess culturally we haven't really been indoctrinated to believe that there is an end, right? Like, there's always more. There's always more. You can always be more, right? There's never enough. We're in this like
Yeah.
consumption and accumulation culture. So, I think that doesn't really fit well with death. Yeah. So I love.
No, right on.
Yeah, and by the way, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about death. I've been in many ways very fortunate. Of course, have had grandparents that passed, and grew up Iraqi American, and so at a very young age, I heard about death kind of secondhand through a lot of family and friends who died in the Gulf War. So I've kind of seen it tangentially and learned about death maybe even before I learned about life. But I think, as an American, again, I don't really talk about these subjects with people unless, they've lost a parent or they lost a sibling. But it just doesn't come up in kind of mainstream culture, the idea that one day we will all die. So I'm curious, from your perspective, why do you think so many people find it so difficult to talk about death? And also, we haven't talked about this yet, but disability. And, for the folks who are listening who don't know about BJ's story, we'll go into that later. But yeah, why do people find it so difficult to talk about these subjects?
Well, I think we've touched on a little bit of the problem, to the degree it's a problem, which is, a culturally, the language we use that we pass on to each other, what frames our experience. Much flows from the words we choose rather than the other direction. So part of it is our own framing, our own construct. In the West, there has been so America as a country per se, the U.S. of A, in particular, was founded on this sort of seeking, this searching, this go over there, that the truth is over there, that there's this that life is that a good American life is that you have these aspirations, you seek this thing that's in front of you, this future state where you can, which means in a way it means like you're not present,
Mm,
almost inherently. You're not taking in what nature's giving you. You are saying, what do you want nature to be?
mm,
It's manifest destiny, and it is a compelling. I buy into the myth of the West myself in all sorts of ways. I do strive. I do seek. I do think that's part of human nature on some level, but and we've just sort of taken it to an extreme here. So that seeking, that searching, that idea that there's something, you're not whole as you are, but you can be if you get over there. So that is a big, big piece of the puzzle. And you watch that play out in our films, our books, our music. So it's not your fault. I mean, we just kind of reify these ideals, and the U.S. is one of the things that's fascinating about this place is it was founded on an idea. America is an idea. It's not, and so ideas are not necessarily the same thing as reality. They're what you might want reality to be like. the pursuit of happiness, a more perfect union. The idea that we're all created equal, an idea that we are created equal, that we as humans have equal value. That that's an idea. I don't know if you look around nature, is there proof of that, all that we're all created equal? I don't know. The closest thing that would be proof of that is that we're all born and we all die. Therefore, in the macro, that by that definition, we are all equal. But boy, in between those two poles, life does not play out equally in so many ways. So anyway, so constructs, language, the way we pass these things on culturally, and of course that just so that's a big piece of it. But that just unfortunately kind of is in collusion with our hormonal lives, our sort of biology too. And it's important to note, lest we get down on ourselves for being in denial or something like that, that we are wired reflexively to fight or flight. That when there's some threat to our existence, we are wired. We get a huge hormonal surge of adrenaline and other things that we either put up our dukes or we we sprint in the other direction. That's a reflex. That's an impulse. That's not your fault. You're born with that. So between our nature and our nurture, between our biology and the sort of cultural social attunement that we've chosen to pursue as a people, they all conspire to keep us a little bit at odds with this idea of death. So no shame in it. I think I'm just happy that for conversations like ours today, like podcasts like yours, where more and more people are talking about this, are trying to make peace with their real nature, and this is a big piece of that. So it's a process. Let's say that.
Right.
And no shame in not somehow mastering this. I don't know anyone who. I'm not sure what mastering death looks like. I don't know if that's even possible. I don't know. But by willing to open yourself to it, willing to lean into things that you don't know, willingness to ask questions that don't necessarily have answers, a willingness to be curious, a willingness to see life inside, but also outside and beyond yourself, your ego. These are all beautiful sort of human, pursuits of their own that can flow and can include sort of a rumination or a meditation on death. So anyway, that does that make sense? I mean, yeah. Does that let you off the hook a little bit?
Yeah. I think, of course, a lot of us, feel shame and guilt and blame around the death cycle, right? Especially when it comes to close friends and family. So I think, the language that we use, like you said, and the construct that exists makes it difficult for us because, like, by default, we kind of are where we are, culturally. So I love, that you and others are, starting to have these conversations and, writing books about it. And I think, again, that's why this is so important. And I especially think it's important since, the pandemic started and there's been so much death, which we'll get into in a little bit. And I actually think this is a good segue to talk about your book, A Beginner's Guide to the End, because I started reading it and I just was, kind of shocked at how little I knew about what goes into the end of life, like all the documents and, the paperwork and conversations that you need to have, not just about, property, but also the emotional conversations. I mean, in many ways, I was kind of, overwhelmed with what happens at that stage, but I also felt very safe, and almost less scared about it because I felt like at least I understood what I didn't want to look at. It's kind of like, not knowing what's happening with your financial situation and then getting an understanding of it. Even if you don't like it, for example, at least right? So,
Right. Yeah.
so yeah, so I think this is just an interesting conversation, I think, for all families to have. And I think everyone should read your book because it's powerful. And I think it also alleviates some of the pressure that happens at the end of life when we don't do all this preparation. So, I don't know if you want to maybe highlight some of the most important things that you have found people need at the end of life. I know that
Yeah.
you have a very lengthy book, but maybe you could summarize it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what? I was talking to someone recently about the book, and the poor woman she was trying to read the thing cover to cover like you'd read a novel, and she was just getting flogged. So I'd point any reader, it'd be uh, to really read the introduction to the book carefully, and also you might jump to the end, kind of in a funny, ironic twist of starting with the end, starting with death, which is much what the book does. The conclusion, I think, is all of a page or two. But the intro and the conclusion will bookend the book itself for you, but also kind of set the table. The book is really a reference guide, and you can look in the table of contents, and it's useful to use it as a resource. So you can pick out an issue that's you're thinking about or that's affecting you or your family, and just go there. Each little chunk is meant to be more or less stand on its own. So you don't have to take all this in one fell swoop. This is a lifetime of work. But we did want to lay out sort of the practical sort of bits of the issues that you will face when approaching the end of your life, at least in our culture, at least in our society here in the West, and the things that you can do about it, and where you got to learn how to let go of control or the need for control, and just sort of lean into the mystery of it all. So, and the reason why Shoshana and I wrote this book was my own work as a hospice and palliative medicine doc. You see so many people suffering at the end of life, whether they're the patient dying themselves or a family member or friend. There's just so much pain around it, and much of that pain, not all, but much of that pain is just unnecessary. It's from a lack of good information, or it's from a lack of a safe place to talk about this because it's considered sort of impolite, or superstition would tell you you can't talk about death because then like somehow you're going to make it happen if you talk about it. So I meet so many people who really want to talk about it and think about it, but they just don't know what words to choose or where it's safe to do so in polite company. So all that unnecessary heartache and pain that we're trying to kind of alleviate that, and then make space for all the pain that you can't do anything about but sit with. And in this way, a book like ours, and sort of just any sort of practice that prepares you for the end of your life, has a way of making hard things less hard and making meaningful things a little bit more meaningful. We're not asking anybody reader to love death or somehow get into it, or you don't even have to make peace with it. I would just love if everyone had some sort of relationship to it,
Right.
because so much wisdom and good stuff flows from that relationship: love, kindness, forgiveness, mutualism, interdependence, humility, curiosity. These all flow pretty naturally from pondering death and the life that it's involved with. So, and then I think that's also worth mentioning that a book like this is important. You could say, "Hey, Yasmin, right? We all die. We've been dying forever. It's in our nature. So why the hell do we need a book like this to tell us how to do this thing that our body's just going to do?" Well, like I mentioned, it's because we've constructed a lot of fantastic ways to struggle where we don't have to. So, and especially it's particularly poignant in our healthcare system, in our medical system, because their death is a failure, and healthcare is not an intuitive system, at least here in the U.S. And navigating it can cause a lot of harm in of itself. So because we have all these convoluted structures or lack of structure around death, you do really need some sort of guidebook, because it's not just a natural process anymore. Humans have intervened in some pretty wacky ways that make what could be a native experience a foreign one. So anyway, that's a long-winded preamble to why we thought a book like this was important in the first place.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Oh, go ahead, BJ.
Well, no, I was going to sort of finally take your question of like what tidbits to pull out of there that I think are really extra important. But no, we can. But please go on. You were going to say something else.
Oh, yeah. No, I'd love to hear your answer to that. I also just wanted to highlight one of the kind of anecdotes that I remember from the book, which is how a woman had put together, towards the end of her life, a box of documents, like all of her passwords and kind of everything that her kids would need. And I think the kids didn't really acknowledge what it was and the importance of it. And then after she passed, they said, wow, that was the best gift that my mom could have given me, this, box of everything that I needed in order to deal with her death. And it's so interesting. I never even thought about it that way. So yeah, I thought that story was really powerful. But if you wanted to talk about some themes, I have so many questions for you. So we can also move on.
Well, yeah, I will say, I mean, I'm just picking up. So the book does follow. There's practical issues, there's paperwork stuff, there's preparing to how to close down accounts and all the things that can chip away at the experience for you or the people who are left behind to grieve you. Um, and that kind of gets at another reason to do your advance directive, to do your estate planning, is it can be tedious, and you don't want to reduce something profound like death to paperwork. But of course, there's a paperwork component to it. We just got to be real. But a lot of that paperwork is there to protect you. So an advance directive is really important to protect your wishes for care if you can't speak for yourself. So, you can't predict when you're going to have an accident or somehow find yourself unconscious in an ICU. That's not the time to prepare yourself or to communicate your wishes to loved ones or what's important to you. And so people are left to guess very consequential medical decisions on your behalf with no guidance. In the medical system now, there's too much that's just possible. We can prop a body up on machines practically indefinitely. I mean, it's ghoulish, but it's true. And so if your view on life is that it's essentially a pulse, and that's as life to you, well, then the medical system, then you can go with its defaults. It'll just keep putting you on more and more machines, more and more meds to prop up that pulse, whether you're conscious or able to move or whatever else. That's the bottom line of life in a medical system. So if you feel differently, then you've got to advocate for yourself. You've got to say at some point, no thanks to that next medical treatment. But the defaults in our system would be to just keep doing more, and you need to say no thanks, and you need to deputize people in your life, healthcare proxies, to say no thanks on your behalf. So that's the kind of thing that goes into an advance directive. So yeah, it's tedious paperwork, but it represents some profound decisions and ways to avoid profound heartache.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so there's that kind of piece. That's where the book starts. Is those are practical tidbits. But also then there's the relationship stuff. So once you kind of come to terms with, on some level, that time is precious, that you're not here forever, that makes you you need to take your time seriously, one way or another. And that may mean sort of letting go of aspirations. Like, hey, if I'm going to die anyway, now that I've kind of dared to ponder it, and hey, if it doesn't matter what I do, or, if what I achieve in life, I'm going to die anyway. Well, heck, maybe I'll go hang out with my friends instead of that 15th hour at work, or whatever it is. It can allow you to take life more seriously, or in a way to let it go, and to let yourself off the hook. Those are both fine responses, but they only come from once you've dared to have some sort of relationship to the idea that you're not going to be here forever. And once you're in there, then it's sort of cleaning out what we say, like clean out your emotional attic. Tend to your relationships. Think about what you're leaving behind, your legacy, not just the stuff, but the feelings, the emotions, the wisdom. So that person you're referencing in your question about who left the box behind, if I remember the story correctly, this is my colleague in palliative care named Ira Byock. He actually wrote a book called Dying Well. Much of my thinking is in his lineage. And his mom left behind this box that included like recipes and things and all sorts of beautiful stuff. And what a gift it was to her family. And this is one of the ways that we can outlive our bodily lives. And so legacy, emotional residue, thinking about the world that is going to keep going without you in it, and ways you might touch that world even from the grave. All that's possible. It just needs a little, some action on your part, some forethought. So anyway, there's just some sort of greatest hits of things to that you'll find in the book, but it's not just that stuff. emotional coping, existential sort of framing. How do you find meaning in your life? How do you let go of the need for meaning if you can't find it? How to cope in general. So, anyway, those are some highlights from the content of the book for you.
Yeah, it's
Sorry, Yasmin.
No, go ahead, go
Sorry. What I'm
ahead.
going to say, one of the more compelling reasons, I may have already said this, but back to your point about the mother who left this box for her kids. Um, Advanced care planning, that kind of thing, preparing yourself for your own death, even if you don't really much care. Like, hey, if you're so limber, you can move with the wind no matter what. If it takes you in an ICU, fine. If it takes you to, dead in the woods, fine. If you're sort of that open, well, you may not be so moved to prepare for your own death. But for your family or friends, it is one of the kindest things you can do is to leave your affairs in order, quote unquote, so you don't leave a big old mess for your loved ones after you're gone.
Right.
And that is one of the more compelling reasons to actually do this work.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think that's what's so powerful about the book is it's not just for your own death, but it's for your family and friends to know how to deal with what you want at the end of life. And I love that you're never too young to start planning because of course like anything can happen at any time, right? So I think, even the idea of leaving a legacy behind, I feel like that's something I can do immediately or start thinking about immediately. And even just the advance directive, right? Like, and that obviously changes as the older I get. And,
Yeah, right on. Yes, and you should plan to change your advance directive over time, like what you're willing to live with, what treatments are available, what diagnoses you might acquire along the way. You get to change your mind a zillion times. That's welcome in this work. It's not. Some people are afraid to do an advance directive because they feel like they're putting their wishes in stone and they can't change it. Not at all. You can rip up your advance directive a zillion times and write a new one. So,
right.
yes.
Right. Yeah. And I love the story about how a grandfather wanted to, I think he like didn't want to be resuscitated or he just wanted to kind of go if he, had that opportunity. And then his wife, someone's grandmother said, no, but I want to keep him alive as long as possible because it'll break my heart if he goes, so it's interesting, like the conversation that needs to be had. Sometimes we don't decide to do what's best for us, but what is best for our friends and family. So yeah,
Right on.
so many great conversation starters, even from that book.
Hmm.
So BJ, I wanted to talk about, so one of the books I read many years ago, which really changed my life was The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. I think it was also in a New York Times article, a couple of the highlights from that book. And this woman was a palliative care nurse. So she talked about some of the biggest regrets that she saw from family members as their loved ones approached death. And I'm wondering if you have maybe any anecdotes or any data to share as you have worked with people at the end of life. Like, what are some things that you're seeing as some of the biggest regrets from family and friends?
Well, I think I think they're not surprising. I think they're more along the lines like, why didn't I spend more time with people I cared about, versus trying to achieve that, staying later in the office yet again, and marginalizing people in your life on behalf of some work accomplishment. I mean, work can be a beautiful thing. I don't mean to demonize work, but it better, if you're going to devote, your life to it, you better make sure that it means a lot to you. That's more your homework. And so that kind of gets at the regrets that people might face is that they didn't really follow their heart. Follow their heart, follow your bliss. I mean, that can feel light, or sort of, even selfish, and sometimes the way it's put around here anyway. But no, no, no. It's more meant to, like, whatever you do. If it's just collecting Coke cans, just care about it, get into it, engage it, love it, whatever it is. So I don't see a lot of people necessarily um, regretting more or less accomplishment per se. It's more, did they invest their whole being into something? Did they let themselves care about something and pursue that care? Did they choose love or did they work from fear? Those get at sort of the admixture of regrets that you see at deathbed moments often. But it's interesting too. I must say, oftentimes one of the things that can happen towards the end of life, especially with enough support, is you kind of come to see, you can come to see or realize that just everything that it just is, like I struggle with regret myself a lot. I spend a lot of time regretting things for whatever reason. I just get stuck in there. And it's very helpful for me to realize that, yeah, regret is just something that humans do. And for me to realize that no matter what I do, I'm going to find something to regret about it. And so in a way, I let myself off the hook. I may still feel regrets, but the notion of regret has lost its charge. Same thing goes with fear, and fear it's related. A fear is regret is something I think of it as as a fear of the past in a way. So similarly, like fear, like it's not that you extinguish your fear; it's that you come to a place where you realize that you're not just afraid. That fear can lose its terror in a way. You can defang it by having a relationship to it, by just accepting it for what it is, and not being ruled by it. So similarly at the end of life, oftentimes at a deathbed, it is a very peaceful place, no matter what kind of life they've had, because by virtue of their body showing them these truths and their own mind showing them these truths and living them, not in the abstract, but actually playing these things out we're talking about here from a distance, you know, I don't see a lot of people plagued by anything at the end of life. It's more those of us who have to keep going and are stuck with our neurotic minds and our projections of terror. That's trickier for family members. But I don't know if that's reassuring or what. But it's been true enough in my experience. Regret is more something that we neurotic living people do.
Well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
um, I wanted to just quickly talk about your journey and what happened to you to lead you to this path. I mean, it's very obvious that you're very contemplative and reflective and very self-aware with the way that you see the world and the way that you talk about, not just death, but also about life. And I hesitated asking this question because, and this is not similar, but I'm just giving an example. But I oftentimes, for example, as an Iraqi American, I want to be acknowledged for that story, but I also don't want to be objectified for it. So I also don't want to objectify you based on what happened to you to kind of lead you on this path, because I think there's so much more of you
Hmm.
than just that experience. But I think maybe it's important to just share what happened for our audience, and if you feel comfortable, what it meant to go through that and how it led you to the place that you are in now.
Oh, yeah, sure. No, and I appreciate that setup too, Yasmin. I really I get what you mean, and at the same time, I'm happy enough to share this part of my experience. It reminds me, I was speaking of regrets. I have all sorts of regrets, as I mentioned. One of them was I was on Fresh Air, the Terry Gross NPR show,
Hmm.
if you know it, and
Yeah.
she asked me, she asked me, did I mind being asked about my injuries? And I gave her a polite answer, which is true enough, which I just said, which is, yeah, no, I don't mind. Hey, look, I get it. I mean, take one look at my body, you can tell something's going on. I would have been curious too. It's okay. It's fine. I can recount it in my sleep. It doesn't really take anything away from me these days. But a fuller answer is, and it gets at, I think, maybe what you're pointing at too, Yasmin, in your own life, is that unfortunately that story can just become the story
Yeah.
and you become flattened by it. And that's all that people see. And it becomes too monolithic too. Like the story of my accident, which I'll get to in a second here. It's my story, but it's a zillion stories, and it's many people's stories, and it has a lot to do with the friendships that came from it, and the friends who helped me survive. And so it keeps getting treated as a story when it's thousands of stories. Actually, is another piece of why a fuller answer to that kind polite question. So anyway, with all of that preamble, so the broad strokes, the gist is, when I was a sophomore in college, November, just after Thanksgiving holiday here, um, I was hanging out with some of my very dear friends, and we were just had a night. We're just hanging out, and we were walking to get a sandwich late at night at the 24-hour market. And this is at Princeton, and that's where we're students. And there's a commuter train that runs right on campus. It used to. The station has since moved, but the train cars were just sort of sitting right there on the edge of campus, parked. Just not. We didn't think we were doing anything kind of crazy. We just decided to climb the ladder, just hop on top of this parked train, like you would climb a tree. Was the impulse. Again, it wasn't moving. We didn't. It was not operating. We didn't think there was much to it. But when I scurried up the ladder, when I stood up, I had a metal watch on my left wrist, and this was a commuter train powered by wires overhead. And when I stood up, I was close enough to that power source, and the electricity arced to the watch, and that was that big explosion. So I got electrical burns, pretty profound, and ended up losing my left arm below the elbow and both legs below the knees, and coming pretty close to the end of my own life. Was in a burning it for several months, touch and go for maybe 6 weeks of that. So that's the broad strokes of sort of the injury itself, how I got into these particular shoes, and that has led me into medicine and all sorts of other things.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's so emotional for me to hear that story. And it's so interesting that you can say it without emotion, because you've probably spent a lot of
Mm.
time dealing, with that narrative. Um, and I think, that's important because I think you had mentioned before, maybe in another conversation, that as a physician, you work with other people who are disabled, and that also gives them hope that there's so much more that you can do in your life, even if you face some disability. So I just think that was the image of that is so powerful in my mind, that you have decided to kind of build, more in one lifetime than most people do in 10. So just thought that was really profound.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you also for your reflections on my question. I really
Mm.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah. BJ, how has the pandemic shifted people's perspective when it comes to death? I mean, this has been like an unprecedented time in this last year or so. I mean, I personally know a lot of people who maybe not, first degree, but second degree, who passed away from COVID-19. And it's just been horrible across the world, right? Yeah, I'm just curious, and it's happened so fast. And I think a lot of people haven't even been able to have proper burials and proper funerals. How has this shifted your mindset, or how do you actually think that this situation has shifted people's perspective when it comes to death?
Right on. Well, and it's still going, right? I mean, we're
Right,
still on. We're not done yet with this thing,
right,
or it's not done with us. So I, as you say, it's the dust hasn't really settled. So there hasn't been uh, this thing called closure or resolution. There's just still so much pain lingering in the air acutely, and a backlog of grief over the past year. And I think most of us don't even know how we feel about it. We don't even know all that. We're not even quite clear, probably, on all that we have lost. Um, so that's obviously hard, and that's obviously sad. Um, but I guess I want to draw attention to where I have a lot of hope. Um, so as a hospice and palliative medicine physician, of course, I see a lot of people who are pretty darn sick and coming towards the end of their life, whether from old age or from illness or whatever else. And I get to meet a lot of people who have gotten a life limiting or life threatening diagnosis. And you watch these folks go through what we call an existential crisis, which essentially is a crisis of meaning. You know, questions of why me, why now, what did I do to deserve this, what's going to happen? This sort of this moment where you find yourself in shoes that you never would want to be in. Um, so an existential crisis is tricky, but it's one of those. It can be a profoundly useful event. I had mine. I've had many. One of them was my own accident that I shared with you a moment ago. Certainly was an existential crisis for me. Like, who am I now? Why me? Who am I? What do I have? How do I make sense of this? What do I do now? What do I do with this? Um, so those are big, big questions, and they're so fruitful. That's my point here. Painful, yeah, but fruitful. Because if you let it, an existential crisis will shake you down. It will discombobulate you. It will upend the things you thought you knew, the things you thought you could take for granted. All of a sudden, you can't. And it has a way of stripping you of all the sort of applique of life, the created self, the made up self, the thing that the things that we acquire or achieve, like we've referenced now a couple of times. That built self that can all go away in an instant, and that sucks. But it also has a way then of showing you what's underneath all that stuff, what's underneath all your protections and all your glitter and all your gloss. And it's earthy as hell, right? It gets down to this nub of an individual, of a person underneath our circumstance. Who are we when we're yanked out of our circumstance? Those are, I'd always wondered, as a young person, kind of just trying to make my way in the world, I always wondered who the hell I was and who was I if I didn't have my parents, or if I didn't have feet, or whatever, if I couldn't rely on a future. And there's only one real way to answer those questions, which is to have yourself a massive existential crisis. You can only get so far with recreational thoughts. Like these are, you can imagine as an undergraduate class studying meaning making, and you can have ideas about it and how you might respond to this or that. But until you're actually in those shoes, you don't know. And this is how you know. So, and then with enough support and enough time, and if you get to hang out on the planet a little while longer, in an existential crisis, you can move through with some grief. Very important piece of the puzzle. We should talk about that. But you can move through it. And on the far side of an existential crisis, you can pop out with a much deeper sense of who you are, who you aren't, clarity around your difference between the things you want and the things you need, a much clearer demarcation of the boundaries between yourself and others. When I say boundaries, I mean the porosity of those boundaries, of how much we need each other and how much we rely on each other to define ourselves. So that's when you pop out the backside, you have a line of sight on all those things. Like for me too, in my existential crisis, I had a sense of who showed up. I felt like I got to attend my own funeral. Like who came, who showed up. I got that window. Those are profound insight, right? You just can't get to these things otherwise. So my hope here is that the pandemic represents, what it does, a massive existential crisis. And and if we let it rip us up, let the china break, well, in time, the dust will settle, and we'll see who we were and are underneath all this stuff. And then we can get busy recreating these things that we had taken for granted, to be more responsive, be more faithful to the experience of being a human being, etc. So there really is, and I don't mean this in a cheap political way, but there is an opportunity to learn a ton and to do differently going forward. If we let ourselves drop the charade, if we let ourselves be discombobulated enough. And my fear is that the pandemic will end and we'll all encourage ourselves and each other to get back to normal. I'm going to hear that phrase again and again. Turn to normal. Like, that phrase sucks. It terrifies me. Like, so we're going to go through all this pain and right at the end, shortchange the lessons and the glory that can come from it. Like I'm talking about, that would be right. What a waste of a good pandemic. So that's my hope. We'll see. talking about it will help. Grieving it will help, because grief will get you in touch with how you feel about all this. Will get you in touch with what you're actually losing and what you actually still have access to. And that sort of transition, that sort of metabolic transition process, is an essential piece of this. If we shortchange our grief, I guarantee you we're not going to get to the lessons that are awaiting us. That's part of the deal. That's part of how we're going to get there.
Yeah. Well, and in our culture, we kind of talk about grief as something that we don't necessarily want to deal with. There's a lot of numbing out in our culture, whether it's through, alcohol, drugs, entertainment. And so I think a lot of people, they just don't want to fall to like that kind of bottom space where you can have that existential dark night of the soul, if you will. But they oftentimes don't know what's coming on the other side of that, right? And so I think that that's what I've seen. The people that are wanting things to go back to normal are just essentially like numbing out to their own emotional and somatic space. Like there's been no connection to that. And I heard this really great quote by Carolyn May. She said, "We either have these moments through crises or curiosity." So it's either crises or curiosity. And of course, I think most of us want to have these moments of awakening and that through curiosity, right? Because then we have less instability happening in our life. But it just takes a lot of courage, really, to be on that path. So,
right on. Yeah, and I would say first, I think I'd refine that a little bit further, and I agree in broad strokes with that statement about curiosity. Like, by force or by choice, you can get there, and then that curiosity is in a way a harder path, because you have to kind of you don't have the crisis to prove it to you in your bones. But the curiosity, I think the missing statement there is, it has to include empathy. Like, you can be a very healthy person with no pain, and to some degree for some amount of time you can. And curiosity, though, like, will pull you towards to look around the corner, but will also pull you to look at the lives of others. And if you're an empathic person and paying attention, you may have very little or no pain or hardship in your life for at least a period. But if you're really paying attention, through mirror neurons and through our ability to empathy, there's no shortage of pain going on in the world around us. So, and there is a directness. There's an indirect component, but there's also a direct component. If we are empathic, we are feeling that pain too. It is our pain too. So in a way, there's sort of a crisis, by like a vicarious crisis, that I think can be an important piece of how curiosity can pull you to this in the same direction, and not leave your somatic, your body behind. Because if you're paying attention, you can feel the losses of others as acutely as you can feel your own.
Yeah. Amen. As a highly empathetic person, I can definitely.
Yeah.
BJ, what sort of things have surprised you the most on this journey? I mean, if you look back on the tenure that you've put Mettle Health together, and everything that happened really in your entire life, what has surprised you the most? What do you want to tell people?
Let's see here. Well, I think we've talked a fair amount about like the things I have to say to people about this big subject. In a nutshell, of pulling life towards death, and seeing the relationship between the two, the package deal of the two, and that's all over the place. Try to know joy. If you don't know sorrow as a human being, these are they may be distinct words, but they're not a distinct experience. Try having a meaningful life with no suffering. Good luck. So I guess so much of any message that I may be trying to relay is just simply that is building the bridges between what feel like opposing thoughts or feelings, and finding a way to learn to live with all of them, and even to see their connections between them. That, I think, much the message that I'm playing out and trying to promote in the world, and practice every day myself. So we've touched on that, but the surprise, I suppose, is I keep realizing that everything, that in us, in each of us, is everything that we need. That if you just tend to daily life, you don't need to go to Princeton, you don't need to get a medical degree. If you just paid attention to daily life, everything we're talking about is playing out right under our noses all the time, especially if you're tuned into nature. This is not, these are not exotic foreign experiences. They may feel that way in detail, but if you're paying attention to yourself, these are all happening in and around you all the time. Death is in and around us all the time. Death of relationships, death of ideas, loss, death of identity. That those are in little deaths that we have over the course of our lives that really do prepare us for the big death on some level. So loss is teaching us things all the time. Go walk in the woods. Try to find yourself like the most bountiful, alive garden. You will find evidence of death all over the place, whether it's fertilizer or a yellowed leaf or whatever it is. It's just all over the place. And it's all over inside of us too. So I guess I'm saying here the surprise is that everything we need to know, as far as I can tell, um, and I don't mean that everything that's knowable, but everything I think that we need to know and can know is actually in and around us always. And to me, it's helpful to say because it's reassuring. There's sort of a confidence that comes from that notion. And there's a way to kind of stand upright, even when society might be telling us to be ashamed because of the color of our skin or because of a number of limbs or where we come from or whatever else. BS. That's made up. That's made up pain. That is not natural pain. And so there's relief. I think there's innocence for us all, and there's wisdom in us all, waiting us if we kind of pay attention. It's not something that happens over there. It's something that happens in here all the time if we look.
Wow. So beautiful, BJ. That was incredibly inspiring. And I think it's so obvious that you have done the work of staying connected to yourself and becoming connected to yourself. Because I think that, that's what you're trying to convey to our audience, which is,
Yeah.
there's the external world and then there's the internal world. And all of our answers are actually inside. We don't have to go out, looking for them and pushing against, our reality. It's really just a powerful message. And I hope that people really take it to heart. So thank you.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I hope people did. I hope I take it to heart. I'm really learning that one too. It sort of gets at how incredibly difficult I find it to. I can love you much faster than I can love myself. I don't know why the hell that is. But part of a follow on to the statement I was just making there is that also including in you towards yourself, it should be love. I don't know why we withhold that from ourselves. I don't know if you do that, but I do that, and a lot of people I know do that. So it's a
Yeah.
work in progress.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think culture also dictates that if you love yourself, that you are selfish. And so I think that kind of, attitude is something that have been kind of spent my whole life working on, the idea of self-love and nourishing myself first before helping others and loving others, right? Because how do we love others unless we love ourselves? I mean, I think then it leads to so much insecurity. And so, yeah, I'm with you on that.
Hmm.
BJ, it's been such a pleasure. I love the way that you articulate yourself and your thoughtfulness. And I'm just so grateful that we've had this time together. And where can people find you? Where are some resources that you can point folks to?
Thanks, Yasmin. It's really a pleasure talking with you. That went super fast. Yeah, so come find us, see us at Mettle Health, Mettle, mettlhealth.com. We're small and we're just getting started and we got a long way to go. So, but we do try to get a little bit more active on social media. So we have an Instagram and Twitter account by the name Mettle Health. Or you can find me on Twitter at BJ Miller MD. Not that the MD is important; it's just that at BJ Miller was taken. So at BJ Miller MD. So those are some places you can find us, and also we got a little. I'm just starting to spit without too much mind towards production quality. I'm just spitting a lot of little videos out in the world. So there's just helpful stuff around caregiving and being a patient, et cetera. You can find some videos on TikTok, although I don't know how to find them, but my friend Faye helps put them out there. So TikTok or YouTube, you can find me and us from Mettle Health too.
Amazing. Oh, amazing. Thank you so much. And we'll include all those links in the show notes. So,
I should also mention the book. Thanks. You were so kind to do so. We do have a beginner's guide to the end. Simon & Schuster published that. You can find that at any old bookstore, Amazon, of course. And we do have a website, a basic website for that book. And that's just the acronym, A Beginner's Guide to the End, abgtte.com. So sorry. Thank you, Wendy, to get that in there too.
Yes. A very important book that I think everyone should read and will definitely promote mental health. I think the work you're doing is incredible. So thank you so much. And for our audience, thanks for joining and for listening. In this episode, we learned about the end of life and how to prepare for death gracefully with BJ Miller. And you can tune in to Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. Thanks again.